Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Tehami and these are the headlines. In Afghanistan, 4 security personnel, including a district police chief, have been killed as the Taliban attacked several checkposts in Herat. According to the provincial governor, 21 Taliban fighters were also killed in the clashes. Earlier, the Taliban claimed they have captured a military base in the Jozjan province, killing 8 soldiers. The United States has called out Yemen's Houthi rebels over their failure to secure a ceasefire and move towards resolving the conflict. In a statement, the State Department said the Houthis bear major responsibility for prolonging the war. The conflict has killed more than 130,000 people and spawned the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The United Kingdom has approved the use of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in children aged 12 to 15. Health authorities say the jab is effective in this age group and its benefits outweigh the risks. Meanwhile, Australia's Melbourne has recorded its first case of the Delta COVID-19 variant. In Pakistan, the virus has claimed 83 more lives and infected nearly 1,900 people overnight. Globally, there are more than 3.6 million deaths and over 172 million cases. China has called on the U.S. to withdraw a ban on investments in dozens of Chinese firms with alleged ties to the military. In a press briefing, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said Beijing strongly condemns the move. Earlier, U.S. President Joe Biden signed an executive order banning investment in 59 Chinese firms, including Huawei. Those were the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. In Afghanistan, 4 security personnel, including a district police chief, have been killed as the Taliban attacked several checkposts in Herat. According to the provincial governor, 21 Taliban fighters were also killed in the clashes. Earlier, the Taliban claimed they captured a military base in Jozjan province, killing 8 soldiers. Violence in Afghanistan has surged in recent months amid the withdrawal of the US and NATO troops from the country. Several judges, teachers and journalists were also targeted in the recent spate of violence. Authorities have revealed that a prominent news anchor was among 4 people killed in Thursday's blast in Kabul. The United States has called out Yemen's Houthi rebels over their failure to secure a ceasefire and move towards resolving the conflict. In a statement, the State Department said the Houthis bear major responsibility for prolonging the war. This comes a day after the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen returned from a trip to Saudi Arabia, Oman and the UAE. Earlier, the UN Special Envoy for Yemen said his peace efforts have been derailed by the voting parties seeking gains on the battlefield. Yemen has been embroiled in a civil war since 2014 when the Houthis seized the capital, Sana'a, forcing the internationally recognized government into exile. The following year, a Saudi-led coalition entered the war to help the government regain control of the territories. The war has killed more than 130,000 people and spawned the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The U.S. says it expects more than 6 rounds of talks to revive the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. Yesterday, Iran and the EU voiced optimism that the next session in Vienna will likely be the conclusive one. In a briefing, State Department spokesperson Ned Price said distrust and indirect nature of discussions are major hurdles. He said the past rounds have helped finalize the decisions that Iran must take to resume compliance with the deal.
There is a mutual understanding as to generally what would need to happen. And at the very highest levels, the shorthand is compliance for compliance. Both sides are engaging in this. I can speak for our side, presumably for the Iranian side too, because they are willing to entertain the proposition of returning to compliance.
Iran has expressed dismay over the suspension of its voting rights at the UN General Assembly. The UN earlier penalized Tehran, Bangui and Mogadishu for not paying dues to the body's operational budget. In a letter to the UN Secretary General, Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif called the decision unjustified and unacceptable. Zarif said Iran's inability to pay the dues stems from the unilateral sanctions US has imposed on Tehran. Meanwhile, a foreign ministry spokesperson says Iran will soon pay its financial contribution to the United Nations. China has called on the U.S. to withdraw a ban on investments in dozens of Chinese firms with alleged ties to the military. Earlier, U.S. President Joe Biden signed an executive order banning investment in 59 Chinese firms, including Huawei. In a press briefing, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said Washington has ruthlessly suppressed Chinese companies. Wang said the move hurts not only the rights and interests of the Chinese companies, but also those of global investors. Biden's new order goes into effect on August the 2nd. The move expands the scope of a legally flawed Trump-era order. The United Kingdom has approved the use of Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in children aged 12 to 15. Australia's Victoria State has detected the Delta COVID-19 variant for the first time in the capital, Melbourne, while India has logged more than 132,000 cases and over 2,700 new fatalities overnight. Globally, there are more than 3.6 million deaths and over 172 million cases.
As the global COVID-19 vaccination drive hits a snag, the IMF and the World Bank have urged the G7 economies to send excess jabs to the developing countries. The U.S. has announced plans to share a stockpile of 25 million unused doses with the world. Guatemala's president says the U.S. will supply 500,000 doses to the Central American country, while Mexico says Washington has pledged 1 million doses of Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. Meanwhile, U.S. Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also vowed to distribute the jabs on a priority basis.
We're sharing them in a wide range of countries within Latin America and the Caribbean, South and Southeast Asia, and across Africa in coordination with the African Union. This includes prioritizing our neighbors here in our hemisphere, including countries like Guatemala and Colombia, Peru and Ecuador, and many others.
In the UK, Public Health England has recorded the highest daily cases since the 26th of March. It has warned that the Delta variant of concern first identified in India is now dominant in Britain. Meanwhile, India continues to face its COVID-induced multifaceted battle.
The major issues we are facing in the process of this vaccination is the lack of availability of vaccination, and the second one is that the process which is conducted, this vaccination process, is a heavy crowded area. So it is the high risk, the people like these disabled people, they are come to the crowd area, and also the availability of the vaccination.
The UAE and Bahrain have made the Pfizer vaccine available as a booster shot for those initially immunized with China's Sinopharm. Officials say the Democratic Republic of Congo is facing a third wave, with its epicenter in the capital, Kinshasa. Meanwhile, the WHO warns that healthcare systems across Africa are far from ready to cope with a fresh surge of infections.
Pakistan has registered 83 more deaths from coronavirus in the past 24 hours. The health ministry says the death toll has risen to 21,105. The virus infected nearly 1,900 people overnight. The country has recorded more than 928,000 cases since the pandemic began, while 856,000 people have recovered from the virus so far. The number of active cases has declined to 51,000, with some 3,500 in critical condition. Meanwhile, the country has reported its lowest positivity ratio in 3 months at 3.58%. Pakistan and the Republic of Kiribati have formally established diplomatic relations at a ceremony in New York. Pakistan's permanent representative to the United Nations, Munir Akram, and his Kiribati counterpart, Teodoro Tito, signed the joint communique. On this occasion, Ambassador Akram congratulated the government and the people of Kiribati. In a tweet, Akram said the two sides pledged to promote tourism, economic and trade relations. They also reiterated to accelerate action on climate change and recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. Both Pakistan and Kiribati are members of the British Commonwealth as well as the Asia-Pacific Group. Pakistan and Egypt have concluded their 2-week-long joint air defense exercise, Sky Guard 1, in Cairo. According to Pakistan's military media wing, the exercise bolstered cooperation and focused on integration and information gathering. Commander Air Defense Command Lieutenant General Hamoud Zaman Khan witnessed the final phase of the live fighting exercise. He lauded the professionalism of participating troops. Pakistan's envoy to Egypt, Sajid Bilal, Director General Air Operations (PAF), Air Vice Marshal Abdul Mueed Khan also attended the ceremony. Egypt has sent a convoy of engineers and building equipment to begin reconstruction in the Gaza enclave. State media reported that dozens of bulldozers and cranes have lined up along the border to begin crossing into the Gaza Strip. The Egyptian presidency says it would allocate $500 million to fund the rebuilding of devastated areas in Gaza. Israel's 11-day assault on the Gaza Strip last month killed over 250 people and left a trail of destruction. Egypt has played a major role in brokering a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel to end the fighting. France has suspended joint military operations with Mali forces after the country's second army coup in 9 months. In a statement, France's Armed Forces Ministry said it awaits guarantees that civilians will return to positions of power in Bamako. It said the decision, taken after consulting Mali's authorities and military, will be reassessed in the coming days. Earlier, French President Emmanuel Macron threatened to pull troops out of Mali if political instability continues. The military detained and ousted the interim leaders on May the 25th, detailing a transition to democracy. The Economic Community of the West African States and the African Union have suspended Mali and threatened sanctions. The U.S. has reaffirmed a promise to uphold Israel's security, terming the commitment as ironclad. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made the remarks in a meeting with Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz.
Gantz is visiting the U.S. to request $1 billion replenishment of its air defense system after the recent flare-up with Hamas in Gaza. The defense secretary vowed to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge and fight regional threats. While U.S. security officials promised to help replenish the Iron Dome system, they also pressed Israel to reduce tensions with the Palestinians. This comes as Benjamin Netanyahu faces the prospect of an end to his 12-year run as premier, but Washington has vowed to support whoever leads Israel. Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza have dismissed a change in the Israeli government. They said the nationalist leader, due to replace Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, will likely pursue the same right-wing agenda. Meanwhile, the International Red Cross says residents in Gaza are traumatized after the 11-day escalation.
In Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi's lawyer says the ousted leader has no legal representative listed in the junta's Secrets Act case. Kin Maung Zaw said the Supreme Court had listed all 5 accused as their representative. He voiced concern that there won't be any transparency with the hearing that is scheduled on June the 23rd. Meanwhile, Myanmar's parallel national unity government has urged the Rohingya to join them in fighting the junta. They have in turn promised to offer justice and citizenship to the persecuted minority. An advocacy group says Myanmar's military has killed 845 people since the February 1 coup. After a voyage of 113 days, a boat carrying dozens of Rohingya refugees has landed on an Indonesian island. The vessel carrying 90 refugees sailed on February 11 from Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar, hoping to reach Malaysia. A monitoring group said 81 refugees have landed on Idaman Island in Aceh, saying they are fine, but authorities say the refugees are not completely safe yet and hopefully they will not be pushed back again. In February, 8 of the 90 people who set out on the voyage were found dead by the Indian Coast Guards. Human traffickers often lure Myanmar's Rohingya with the promise of work in Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons says Syria has likely used chemical weapons 17 times. The head of the watchdog, Fernando Arias, told the UN Security Council that its experts have investigated 77 allegations against Syria. He said the presence of a new chemical agent was found in samples collected in large storage containers. Arias said the declaration submitted by Syria cannot be considered accurate and complete. He said his organization will take up the issue at its next consultations with Syria. Meanwhile, Syria's envoy to the UN said finding traces of a chemical agent in a test sample is not enough evidence. In Sudan, thousands of people rallied outside the Prime Minister's office to remember the protesters who were killed 2 years ago. More than 100 people were killed when forces dispersed a sit-in outside the military headquarters in 2019. Demonstrators marched through the streets of Khartoum, calling for the prosecution of those responsible. The current transitional military civilian government launched an investigation in 2019, but the panel has repeatedly missed deadlines for reporting, angering victims' families and the rights groups. Belarus opposition says the US, the UK and the EU must ask together to pressurize President Alexander Lukashenko. Speaking to the media, opposition leader Svetlana Tikhonovskaya said she was not invited to the G7 summit in Britain, but was confident that Belarus opposition's issue would be raised and addressed at the meeting. Leaders from the world's group of 7 nations will hold the summit in Cornwall, southwest England this month. Meanwhile, the bloc has adopted a plan to ban Belarus airlines from flying over the EU territory or landing in EU airports. Diplomats said the proposal also prohibits EU airlines from flying over Belarus from midnight. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In the U.S. state of Minnesota, law enforcement officers in Minneapolis shot dead a suspect wanted for a gun possession charge. This sparked a small protest in a city still rattled by the murder of George Floyd in police custody a year ago. Officials said the subject, who was in a parked car, failed to comply and produced a handgun. They say this resulted in task force members firing upon him. The statement added officers attempted to revive the man, but he was declared dead by paramedics on the scene. A woman who was in the car with the suspect sustained minor injuries from the shattered glass. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension will lead an investigation into the shooting. Canada has promised to direct more resources to address violence against Indigenous women, but gave no time frame. This comes 2 years after a report into the deaths of more than 1,000 Indigenous women and girls in recent decades. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada's systems have failed the Indigenous women. The government promised to give Indigenous communities more control over social services and improve access to healthcare. The government says it will address systemic racism among the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It is the national law enforcement agency responsible for policing many rural areas in the country. Earlier, the remains of 215 children were found at the site of a former residential school for Native children. U.S. intelligence officials have found no evidence that aerial sightings in recent years were alien spacecraft. The New York Times says the phenomenon remain unexplained in a highly anticipated government report. It says most of the incidents did not originate from any American military or other advanced U.S. government technology. Many of the 120 plus sightings were reported by the U.S. Navy personnel, and some involved foreign militaries. The paper says the U.S. officials believe experiment technology of a rival power could account for at least some of the incidents. An unclassified version of the report expected to be submitted to the Congress by June the 25th. International experts have been deployed to help Sri Lanka contain a potential oil leak from a burnt-out container ship. The ship, carrying 350 metric tons of oil, has been burning off Colombo for over 14 days and is now partially sunk. The ship's company says foreign experts are coordinating with Sri Lankan authorities on a plan to deal with a possible spill. The company's chief executive also apologized to Sri Lanka for the disaster, which swamped beaches with plastic pellets. Sri Lanka Navy spokesperson said choppy seas and poor visibility prevented Navy divers from checking the hull. Meanwhile, marine protection authorities have placed oil dispersants and skimmers should the vessel leak oil on board. France is sending the U.S. as a replica of the historic Statue of Liberty it gifted in 1884 to rekindle the centuries-old friendship. More in this report.
New York's Lady Liberty is set to get a new sister as a French museum plans to send its replica to the United States in time for Independence Day. France sent the first Statue of Liberty, which towers more than 92 meters and weighs 225 tons, to the U.S. in 1886. Prominent French figures, including engineer Gustave Eiffel, the brainchild of the Eiffel Tower, and architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who also worked on Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral, were involved in the statue's construction.
This cast is in a 1/16th scale, meaning the Statue of Liberty is exactly 16 times bigger than this cast, and it depicts all the elements that you see. The torch, meaning liberty illuminating the world. So you do have the sculpture cast created by Bartholdi that served as a model to create New York sculpture.
Museum director Marie-Laure Estignard said both the original and the replica symbolizes the French and American friendship. It is expected to arrive at the capital around July 14th, marking France's National Day. The replica will then be transported to the French embassy in Washington, D.C. as part of a 10-year loan.
This replica will depart on June 7 from here. I think it will arrive in New York on July 4th, the date of American Independence Day. And then it will arrive in Washington, D.C. on July 14th, which is French National Day. So we are well commemorating the history of French-American friendship by respecting the dates on the statues.
It is one of the biggest tourist attractions in the United States, which welcomed 4 million people yearly before the COVID-19 era.
In Bolivia, indigenous women are learning martial arts to fight back against domestic violence. Details in this report.
In their distinctive billowing skirts and bowler hats, the Amara women in Bolivia's highlands are taking Taekwondo classes to learn self-defense. These indigenous Cholita women belonging to the high-altitude cities of La Paz and El Alto have long faced discrimination. The training is a part of a female empowerment drive by the Warmi Power Project.
I have suffered a lot. That's why I am now practicing self-defense. What is self-defense practice for? It is to defend myself from the blows and kicks in the face, from the fists that hit me in the eyes until they almost explode. Men are not afraid of hitting women. They don't think that by hitting us and mistreating us, they hurt us physically. That is why we live in a great fear. I have suffered a lot of physical and psychological abuses since I was a child. Up to now that I am an older woman, I have always suffered a lot.
The self-defense classes are taught free of charge by instructors from the Warmi Power Project, which says it has already reached some 20,000 Bolivian women.
We teach them basic techniques to escape aggression so that they can defend themselves from any aggression. We also want to empower them. We want to bring out all the strength that they have. Our workshops look at psychology, attitude, and emotions to empower women to be able to stop certain aggressions. So women can recognize when they are in a situation of violence, a toxic relationship, and can stop violence before it occurs and reaches a femicide.
UN Women data shows 8 out of 10 Bolivian women suffer some type of violence during their lifetime. This year, Bolivian authorities have already tailed 48 femicides, mostly by partners or husbands of the victims.
Another business updates. European stocks have inched higher in cautious trading ahead of the US jobs data. The economic recovery hopes are putting the main index on course for its third straight week of gains. The pan-European stock 600 index edged up, trading just below its record high hit earlier this week. Both the French CAC and Germany's DAX edged higher, while the FTSE 100 lagged behind its continental peers as investors digested the UK's review of the traffic light system for international travel. Another weather situation from around the globe. And that is all for now. With the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.